I want to introduce you to Amy Argetsinger. She's with the Washington Post, one of the great friends of the National Book Festival. We're so glad to have you. Welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm Amy Argetsinger. I'm an editor for the Style section of the Washington Post. Welcome to the Library of Congress's 19th Annual National Book Festival. I'm very pleased this afternoon to be introducing Thomas Mallon, one of our most prolific authors of literary historic fiction. Over the past 25 years, Mallon has set the standard for what it means to be a true Washington novelist. His books have gone beyond political intrigue and social satire to explore the emotional lives of the human beings propelled or caught up in the machinations of our federal city. Henry and Clara was a deep, imaginative reconstruction of the lives of the little-known young couple who shared the box at Ford's Theater with President and Mrs. Lincoln, both before and after that tragic night in 1865. Dewey Defeats Truman found an unexpected way to dramatize the political tensions of 1948 by embedding into the small town of Owasso, Michigan, the hometown of candidate Tom Dewey, exploring the lives and loves and personal dramas of a community that fully expected its favorite son to become president. Two Moons is a portrait of semi-corrupt Washington bureaucracy, but told through the story of a love-struck astronomer at the U.S. Naval Observatory in the 1870s. Fellow Travelers dramatizes the paranoia of the Joe McCarthy era with the story of a clandestine love affair between two gay staffers in the State Department. In Watergate, a novel, Mallon dove deep into the personal dramas of a multitude of personalities in Richard Nixon's White House, bringing to life lesser-known characters like Fred LaRue and Rosemary Woods. And he accomplished a similar feat with Finale, a rich multi-character saga of the second-term Reagan administration. And now, with this year's novel, Landfall, he presents the romantic comedy-like relationship of two federal staffers amid the drama of a Bush White House, grappling with both the chaos of post-invasion Iraq and the debacle of Hurricane Katrina. The New York Times called it smart and knowing and absorbing. Thomas Mallon lives in Washington. He's a former professor in the English department of George Washington University. He will be taking your questions at the end of his presentation, and he will also be signing books for you from 2:30 to 3:30 in line 1 of the book signing area. And here I feel the need to warn you that he will be seated right next to Thomas Mallon at the same time. So please get a good look at him, make sure you're in the right line, accept no substitutes. I'm very pleased to introduce Thomas Mallon.
Good afternoon. Landfall is the third volume in an accidental trilogy of mine. I didn't know that I was going to be writing a trilogy when I started with Watergate. Had I known that the volume that followed that, about the Reagan years, was going to be the middle volume of the trilogy, I would not have named it Finale. Which caused some problems for the marketers. But nonetheless, that's what this is. And it didn't really start out, as I say, to be a trilogy, but it turned into this sort of chronicle. I've become kind of like the epic poet of Republican catastrophe. It shows all of these presidents at the lowest point in their fortunes. Nixon, obviously, during the Watergate Scandal. President Reagan in 1986, when everything seems to be going wrong. The Reykjavik summit collapses. It looks pretty good in retrospect. It didn't at the time. The Democrats are retaking the Senate. Iran-Contra is bursting open, and a whole panoply of social ills like AIDS and homelessness seem to have Reagan losing his touch. And this novel about President Bush, the second President Bush, is set during 2005, 2006, which were probably the roughest years of his administration, the ones that contained Hurricane Katrina and the worst of the Iraq insurgency that he would try to counter with the surge. I mean, if you read George W. Bush's own memoirs, he talks about how after Hurricane Katrina, he more or less knew that his presidency was over. The chance really to accomplish something bold was pretty much gone. This book, like all historical fiction, is a libel upon the people in it. I make things up. I insert characters who didn't exist. There are events that didn't take place. But I adhere pretty closely to the public line of events. I don't alter the public chronology, where people were on a different day, things like that. I don't write alternate history fiction, which is the kind of genre fiction, you know, where the South wins the Civil War or something like that happens. I try not to write what might have happened instead, but what might have happened in addition to what we already know. So during this period, Ann Richards, if you're quite young, you may be forgetting who Ann Richards was, but Ann Richards had been the very flamboyant Democratic governor of Texas for 4 years. She was very quick-witted, was famous for saying about President Bush's father that he was born with a silver foot in his mouth. She served one term, and then she was ousted from office by the very young George W. Bush in 1994, which was really the beginning of George W. as a national figure. And by the time this book takes place, she has been out of politics for quite a while. She operates in this book sort of the way Alice Roosevelt Longworth did in my Watergate novel. She's a kind of one-woman witches chorus, commenting on the action with a great deal of jaundiced perspective. But she was a favorite guest of Larry King on his program. She was on a number of times. He liked to have her come on and talk about things. So I have her on with Larry King on February 2, 2005. She's in the green room, getting ready to go on. They're going to do commentary on the President's State of the Union address that night. Bush has been inaugurated for a second term a few weeks ago. She was never on the program that night. None of this ever happened, but it sort of could have in the way of historical fiction. I'm going to read this, then I'll talk a little bit about things that were tricky in writing this book, and then I'll be happy to take questions. Ann Richards, now 71 and 10 years out of politics, took a sip of iced tea. "Are you sure you don't want something else?" a pretty young network assistant asked. "We've got some wine coolers in the fridge." "Oh, honey," replied the former Texas governor, "I'm as dry as shrub there." She pointed to the TV image of George W. Bush making his way down the aisle of the House chamber to deliver his fourth State of the Union message. "A bit more tangy, I hope, but I've got just as firm a seat on the wagon." Larry King opened a can of cream soda. "You're not off salt, too, are you? I'm supposed to watch my intake." He took a handful of pretzel nuggets from a little bowl. Richards had accepted a booking on a special edition of Larry King Live to be broadcast late tonight after the speech was delivered and the network's regular commentators had had their say about it. King occasionally did his show from New York instead of LA and had taken advantage of his East Coast presence tonight to schedule Ann, who'd lived over near Lincoln Center for a few years and still did a lot of political consulting for a firm up here. She'd agreed that the two of them would watch the speech together, since viewers would expect it to be a big part of their later conversation. "Larry, honey, when we're on the air, you're going to ask me some actual questions, right? Not just say, 'Ann, your take?' I will strangle you with your suspenders if you don't get at least a little specific." "Plenty of questions, I promise, plus your phone calls." The phrasing he always used at the top of the hour had just popped out. "I mean, you know, the home audience's calls." Richards looked at the TV screen. "This damned event always seems longer than the Oscars." "That's good," King responded. "Say that when we're on." She sipped some more tea as Bush mounted the rostrum and shook hands with the rounded forms of Denny Hastert and Dick Cheney. "They look like two of those Russian nesting dolls. Like they're waiting to see which one is going to be asked to encase the other. I do hear that old Denny behaves as if Cheney is his boss." "Interesting," said King, before he and Richards and the assistant fell to listening quietly for a few minutes. The president was soon praising a rise in home ownership, and after that, the way his administration had, quote, prosecuted corporate criminals. I always kind of liked Kenny Lay, said Richards, recalling the disgraced boss of Enron. He was pretty square with me, so don't ask me about him when we're in the studio, Larry. Point taken, said the host. Bush proceeded to talk about the success of the No Child Left Behind Act, and after that, the wonders of ethanol. King couldn't understand why he was bothering with the latter, since he would never again have to face the voters of Iowa. But his brother might, Richards explained, or some tiny shrub that's still a seed, maybe one of the little brown ones, she added, using 41's awkward term of affection for his half-Mexican grandchildren by Jeb. This dynasty business bother you, Anne? Asked King. She ignored the question, listening to Bush make his pitch for immigration reform. What's all this domestic stuff, she finally asked. Wasn't he saddling up for the Crusades just 2 weeks ago? It does seem like a change of pace. So we must join together to strengthen and save Social Security. This is Bush on screen. Oh, dear God, said the former governor, almost in a whisper, here it comes. Is that disgust I'm hearing? Asked King. Awe? Awe. They say Social Security is the third rail of politics. Here he is, not afraid to touch it. Oh, Larry, he could piss on it and not have enough brain cells to feel himself get electrocuted. By 2033, the trust fund's annual shortfall will be more than $300 billion. By the year 2042, the entire system will be exhausted and bankrupt. He'll be 96, Richard hollered, and still getting a check from his grandpa's trust fund. Quick math, praised King. The two of them could hear boos coming from the Democratic side of the aisle. Turn it up, sweetie, Richards commanded the assistant. I could swear there's hissing, too. I will work with members of Congress to find the most effective combination of reforms. I will listen to anyone who has a good idea to offer. Wasn't that pretty much how he governed in Texas? Asked King. He never governed. Bob Bullock did. Richards embarked on a fast tutorial about the peculiar legislative power reserved to that state's lieutenant governors, and how it had been Bullock, a Democrat, who succeeded in pushing Bush's programs through the ledge in Austin. Bullock started out as a mean old segregationist and ended up with even more regrets than ex-wives. By the time Georgie came to town, Bob was a self-pitying wreck who hit on the idea that respectability would descend on him if he made this boy a statewide success and then helped him become president. He could imagine the Medal of Freedom dangling from his neck as easily as I can feel this thing around mine. She raised and let go of the silver and turquoise lavalier she was wearing. Of course, he up and died a year before Shrub made it to Washington. Her voice began to trail off. Bullock was all right to me when I was coming up, but the president was now setting forth the intricacies of personal retirement accounts, which he promised would take the pressure off Social Security. Put this damn thing on mute, said the former governor. The assistant obeyed. How are we going to do our prep? King wondered. Just a little break, said Richards, who swallowed some more tea in the now silent green room. She regarded the televised image of the president and seemed somehow cut in half, separated from himself by his dark red tie. How's Molly? King asked softly. Not good, Richards informed him. The cancer's back. The Texas columnist, another of Larry's prized guests, had a tongue as sharp as Richards' own. Rough, said King. She's been battling it for years. Still smoking, drinking too. Richards looked away from the screen, shifting her gaze to an unwatered plant not far from the TV. She and Bullock liked each other, even though he called her a hairy-legged liberal. Her expression had turned wistful. She extracted a compact from her purse and looked at her own still beautiful, deeply lined face in the little mirror, which was too small to include her formidably beehived white hair. Did you ever think he'd get so far? Asked King, eager to change the subject back to Bush. Was it mostly 'cause of Rove? You mean turd blossom. That's what Bush calls him, you know. Richards thought of how the two men, callow candidate and soulless consultant, had, quite to her astonishment, maneuvered her out of the governor's mansion 10 years before. She'd never succeeded in rattling Shrub, who had no more to offer than ownership of a baseball team as his outstanding qualification for the state's top job. She pummeled him by the hour, even taunted him in the elevator on the way up to their one debate, sure she could break his drugstore cowboy stride. But nothing had worked. You know the reason Rove's office in Austin had no windows? She asked King. So he could concentrate? It was an environmental measure for the protection of the public, so they wouldn't be downwind of him. King laughed. Remind me who it was you beat the first time. In '90, Clayton Williams, the richest rancher and most ridiculous fool you ever met. He won his primary by out good old boy and his opponent. And you know who that was? Little Kent Hance, the only man who ever beat Georgie way back when he ran for Congress in '78. Needless to say, Hance had turned Republican. All that part of the state did during Reagan's time. Shrub even moderated a GOP debate between Hance and Clady. You know, Larry, Texas is really just a small town that happens to be the size of France. I got to bring us back to the present, Anne. King unmuted the TV. For the good of families, children, and society, I support a constitutional amendment to protect the institution of marriage. Richards remained silent. How was she supposed to listen to this anti-gay guff without remembering the Dyke rumor that Rove had floated past the electorate and her 4 grown kids when he was running young George against her in '94? He'd knocked her so badly off balance that even tonight, 10 years later, she thought it better not to tell Larry she had plans for a ginger ale nightcap with half in, half out of the closet Liz Smith, the New York Post gossip columnist. Taking on gang life will be one part of a broader outreach to at-risk youth, and I am proud that the leader of this nationwide effort will be our First Lady, Laura Bush. Oh, that'll stop them, Richards cried. Those Crips are going to be clamoring for library cards from Watts to the south side of Chicago. In a lower, more peevish tone, she told King, you know, I executed 48 people and had 2 times as many folks in prison when I left Austin as when I got there. But Shrub made me out to be soft on crime, and the voters bought it. The president seemed ready to switch back to foreign affairs. There are still regimes seeking weapons of mass destruction, but no longer without attention and without consequence. Richards lifted her seat cushion. Did you lose something? The assistant asked. Just checking for WMDs. Any in your chair, hon? King noticed how a pin she wore glinted when she shifted. Richards could see him peering at it. Yeah, it's a Silverfoot, a commemoration, she explained, of the jibe at Bush's father that had made her famous back in '88. Poor George, he can't help it. He was born with a silver foot in his mouth. Did you have it made? Asked King. Hell no, it was a present from George Herbert Walker himself. Classy guy, said King. Richards dismissively flicked her wrist. Up to a point. You can bet that the missus didn't sign the card. She's meaner than Bullock was with a quart of booze inside him. Look around her neck and you'll find all the pearls of wisdom that didn't go to her son. Funny stuff, said King. But believe me, she is his mother's son. I think I'm going to stop there. So I can... Thank you. Since I can, I'll just talk a bit before we do questions. I always debate with myself when I'm doing something for this book, which scene to read from. Sometimes I read this one. There's also a scene, the one that was remarked upon by every single reviewer of this book, which was a scene that takes place much later in the novel, in September of 2006, between Condoleezza Rice and the Canadian Foreign Minister, Peter MacKay. Condi Rice went up to Nova Scotia, where this young, strapping, handsome Canadian Foreign Minister, who had been voted Canada's sexiest male MP 5 different times, where he was from. And they had a commemoration of the people in Nova Scotia who had helped with all the planes that were diverted on 9/11. There's a musical in New York about this you've probably heard of called Come From Away. And so Condi was up there to make nice with the Canadians. She and Peter MacKay had hit it off from the moment he had taken his new job as foreign minister early that year. And the press were there for a press conference at a lodge in his hometown. She'd come up the night before, she'd had dinner with his parents, had stayed at the lodge, and so they were having this very friendly news conference. And it was reported on the next day in the New York Times. And it said in the actual news dispatch that the foreign minister said, "I'm just delighted to have Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, here in my hometown," and talking about how well they got on and how many things the United States and Canada still saw eye to eye on, and so forth. And he says, "And it's a pleasure to be in her company. I'm learning so many things about her." And one of the reporters said, "Well, like what? What's something you've learned about the secretary?" And he said, "I've learned that she likes to sleep with the window open." Now, if you're a historian, you have to treat that fact with a certain caution, skepticism, whatever. If you're a historical novelist, your duty is to be somewhat irresponsible with the facts that you have researched and to turn them to your own purposes. I mean, really, if you're not going to run with that as a novelist, you have no business being a novelist. You should just be a historian instead. So there's a chapter in this novel about sort of the afterglow moments for Condi Rice and Foreign Minister McKay. The business of historical fiction is very strange. As I say, it calls for a certain irresponsibility, and yet there's always a fine line. Did you go too far? Did you change something implausibly to the point where the reader won't believe it, and the reader may be entertained but say, "Oh, well, I can't really buy that. I can't enter into it," and find that the illusion has been killed. So it's always walking that sort of slippery slope between fact and fiction that historical novelists participate in. And this book, the end of this accidental trilogy, presented some particular unusual circumstances for me. For one thing, it was so close to us in time that it felt still like the news more than history. I mean, it's set 2005, 2006. I was writing the book in 2016, 17 for the most part. So there was that. One good feature from my point of view of the Watergate novel and finale about the Reagan years was that most of the principals, the principal characters and so forth, were either dead or had long since quit the scene. Whereas in the Bush novel, in Landfall, a lot of the people were still very much on the scene. So that was one peculiar set of circumstances. Another was that in a strange peripheral way, extremely peripheral way, I had been a part of these events and this administration. I was the deputy chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities for a while. Laura Bush was a reader of my books. I think, despite what Ann Richards says, I think enormously highly of Mrs. Bush, who founded the National Book Festival back in 2001. First one took place 3 days before 9/11. I mean, as a power center within any administration, the NEH is sort of roughly beyond Pluto, But, you get invited places, you see things, you hear things, you get to know people who actually are participating in some of these things. And this book, in many ways, is a very dark book about Iraq, about Katrina, about real political failure and so forth. But one of the things I did was draw on my own experience for this book. One of the things we did at NEH was we had a series of emergency grants for New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast. We got a lot of money down to Louisiana and Mississippi very fast so that they could keep mold off books, paintings, things like that. I went to Afghanistan for a week. We were trying to help the old Kabul Museum, which had been scarred by war with the Soviets, by the occupation of the Taliban. We were trying to help them get back up on their feet. And so there were bits and pieces of my own experience that found their way into the novel for other characters. I mean, this is the only time I have ever written a novel where I've consulted my own diary. and took down the one where I had been in Afghanistan. And another difficulty was I had gotten to know Mrs. Bush slightly, really very slightly, but thought well of her and felt uncomfortable about having her as a character in the book. And this was a dilemma for me because the first ladies have always been characters in these books. Pat Nixon was a major character in Watergate. Nancy Reagan is a raw nerve walking through finale. And I thought, I feel kind of uncomfortable with Laura Bush. So she has a small role in the book, but I remembered luckily, this was the rare president who also had a mother who was First Lady. So I kind of offloaded the First Lady duties more to Barbara Bush in this. I'm delighted to take questions about this, but I'm going to answer what I know will be the first question, because it's always the first question when I talk about this book. And I figure I will just answer it without its being asked. Am I going to write about the current administration? And my answer is to quote King Lear, never, 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 never. In fact, I write for The New Yorker pretty often, and in 2016 they had me writing an essay about how I might go about turning the 2016 election into a novel. And so I pondered this at great length, and I thought, oh, well, Hillary would be a bonanza to a novelist. Terribly conflicted, compromised, started out with a great deal of ideals, getting her turn at things rather late in the game. We've seen Hillary in fiction before. She's Carol Kennicott in Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. She's Sue Bridehead in Jude the Obscure. She's a rich character for a novelist. And then I contemplated what one would do with her opponent. I believe that one of the kinder lines in the piece was that a novelist would have trouble with him because he lacks even the 2 dimensions required of a sociopath. As you may have guessed, I occupy the smallest and unhappiest political niche in Washington, D.C., the more or less extinct never Trump sliver of moderate conservatives. So I am leaving that to somebody else. In fact, one of the people who said, oh, he'll probably take on Trump next was the reviewer in the Times, and I got an email from my friend Christopher Buckley, the novelist, son of William F. Buckley, the day after the review ran, and the subject line was, "Don't you dare." He says, I'm 25,000 words in. And I think it even comes out this fall, and Christopher's working title is Make Russia Great Again. So perhaps he'll be here next year. Anyway, we have about 10 minutes. I can't see any, oh, now I can see anybody if I shade my eyes. Anybody with questions? Okay.
I want to speak. Here. Go ahead. Okay. Oh, hey. Thank you. I have the book. I have your book right here. And this is just a question because you mentioned about there's a fine line with historical fiction. So about the recent portrayals of George W. Bush, like in Vice or W, which one of those do you think does a much better job at your own definition of the historical fiction, though, like that?
I'm sorry, I missed which between 2 things to choose?
W and Vice, the 2 movies. Yeah. And which one of those?
Oh, I have not seen Vice. I've read about it. It sounds pretty out there. This is the movie that centers on Dick Cheney. I've not seen it. I'll probably catch it at some point, so I feel wrong to comment on it. I do remember he, in a speech, even once ventured into the whole notion of historical fiction and its possibilities. One of the things I used to think historical fiction could accomplish, particularly in these really at our throats political times, is I thought it could give readers an insight or a familiarity with the psychology of people they did not like politically. I mean, I've over the years had many people say to me, you know, I never thought I could stand reading anything from Nixon's point of view, or God, you made me somewhat sympathetic to Reagan. I mean, I see him a little bit from both sides now. I don't have that much faith in this genre anymore because I think our political times are so dark right now. But one time, Cheney said that he asked his wife, does it bother you that I'm so frequently compared to Darth Vader? And she answered him, no, it humanizes you. And I'm sure that was a joke that was written by a speechwriter for him, but you can sort of see the point. In a way, the displacement of real people into fiction and the chance to see them from the inside out as what are called point of view characters does offer something, I think, that maybe even biography doesn't, that biography has to stop short of offering. And so that would be my higher hopes for historical fiction. Okay, somebody else? Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about the research that you do for your characters. I recently read Watergate, and I thought that you perfectly captured Alice Longworth. I'd read Hissing Cousins, and that gives such a great portrayal of her and Eleanor. And I wondered, with ancillary characters in your books, do you dive deep into them, or do you, because it's historical fiction, do you kind of glaze the surface of their public persona and kind of run with it?
I really try to get my hands on just about everything I can. Watergate was full of characters who were briefly famous, like Fred LaRue, you know, who testified for a couple of days before the Irvin Committee. And they would have had profiles written about them in the newspapers for a day or two. And then, unless you were a real Watergate buff, you didn't know much else about them. But Watergate was, it was one of the two events I've written about. The other was a small nonfiction book, excuse me, that started as a long New Yorker profile that involved the Kennedy assassination. The two events that I lived through as a boy, I was 12 when President Kennedy was killed, and as a college and graduate student, the Watergate Scandal. Those were the two most chronicled events of my lifetime. And with Watergate, you had these enormous stretches of transcript from legal proceedings, from the Irvin Committee hearings, from the House Judiciary Committee hearings. You also had a bookshelf full of memoirs. Everybody involved in Watergate wrote a memoir, sometimes only to pay their legal bills. But it saw this great sort of literary production. The other one-time incomparable resource for that novel was, of course, the tapes, where you can hear Nixon, not so much the tapes in the office, but the ones that were recorded off the telephone, sometimes late at night when he's venting. You can sometimes hear the ice cubes tinkling in the glass over the phone, and it's a matchless, candid look into everybody. But I mean, I think that unless you do a lot of research, you won't get anywhere. The more small things that you get right and accurate, the bigger, the more you'll be allowed to get away with the big things. The reader's less likely to notice them if the reader has confidence in the surface texture of the book. John Updike one time described fiction as a tissue of microscopic accuracies. It seems odd to apply the word accuracies to a definition of fiction, but he meant if you get things wrong about how people dressed, how they spoke, what music they were listening to, things like that, the reader will lose confidence in the bigger things, like the psychology of the characters, the themes, and so forth. So there was a lot of stuff for that book.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So
Somebody else?
following on that question with your research process, what's your signal that it's time to stop that and start writing? And do you end up going back and researching more?
One thing I learned, and I think I learned this when I was writing a dissertation 45 years ago, whatever it was, you have to start writing before you stop researching. And I think that's true of a novel as well as something like a dissertation. If you fall into that trap of thinking, I can't write a word on this subject until I've read every word that's ever been written on it, you really never get started. So I do kind of about 6 months of macro research, to be jargony about it, where I get the basic plot line in my head, a basic sense of the events I want to cover. And then I try to start writing and then to research on a kind of need-to-know basis. Many years ago, I wrote a novel called Henry and Clara, which was mentioned in the introduction, about the couple who were in the balcony with the Lincolns on the night of the assassination. And I remember I had to stage a wedding in the 1840s when the woman, Clara Harris, her widowed father was marrying her fiancé Henry's widowed mother. I mean, this was a wonderful story. There was a whiff of incest around the whole thing, aside from all else. And I thought, well, okay, I've got to stage a wedding that a widow is having in the 1840s. What would a widow wear? That sounds like a tongue twister. To such a wedding. And I found an 1840s book of etiquette, and it said that frequently the choice of color for a widow's dress at that time at a wedding was maroon. Who knew? But that was the kind of thing where I had been writing steadily up to that point, and then just said, okay, now I need to stop and find out the things I need to know just for this chapter. Okay, I think we got time for 1 or 2 more, 5 minutes? Yes.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, I don't know who you are. I can't see you, but I'm happy to see
Peggy
you.
Blair. I've interviewed
hi.
you in
Yes.
the past. Hi. Now that you're writing about people who are still alive, or at least their immediate family still alive, are you worried about being sued, or are your editors worried about your being sued? And if so, how does that kind of hamper your creativity?
These books, when you're writing about presidents, cabinet officers, things like that, you're writing about people who operated at such a high level of fame that they were then and forever after public figures. American libel law is extremely generous, much better than the British version of it, as my late friend Christopher Hitchens, who's a character in this book, would be happy to tell you. I think you have to be relatively uninhibited. And I mean, this book tries to see people from the inside out. I don't, nobody is especially villainous. There were many, many things I liked about President Bush. I liked them more all the time. And I'm proud to have served in the administration and so forth. I hope I'm still on the Christmas card list after this. But the book, it tries to see him with a level of understanding, a kind of affection and balance and so forth. But I think mostly, Evan Thomas last night was talking about all the things that editors do for writers. And one of the things that's helpful when I'm writing is I've had the same editor for more than 25 years, Dan Frank, at Random House, the Pantheon imprint. And I sort of think, Dan's my first reader, or my partner, Bill. What are they going to think of this? And I just try to block out what the characters themselves will think about the book once it's done. I think I think, as you probably can sense, although this is in many ways a very sad book, things that happen in it, but I have essentially a comic sensibility about politics and so forth. I'm losing it month by month, but I think that softens what might be the sharper, potentially unpleasant aspects of the book too. One more? Yes.
Yeah, we have one.
Yes.
Here's the microphone, sir.
So if you're not going to tackle the current administration next, what is next? What's the next historical novel?
Well, as Ronald Reagan might say, I'm sort of pulling a reverse Reagan. I'm forsaking politics for show business, at least for a while. And I'm at the beginnings of a novel about a real-life actor, a fairly obscure actor, who was murdered in New York in 1980. And so I just made a research trip a little while ago to California to interview an actress who was an absolute pistol and sounded exactly like Ann Richards, grown up in Texas, an actress who had worked with this fellow many years ago. So I'm kind of taking a breather. And maybe when we all come back to our senses, I'll come back to politics. But I think that's probably a good idea for me anyway. A lot of the same methods and so forth will operate with this book, even though it's far removed from the subject matter I've been at for really 10 years.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, all of you.